Hi there. I want to talk about a podcast that John Vervaeke was on. He mentioned me and he said something that was so true. So I want to talk about it. And I want to talk about the podcast. The podcast name was The Meaning Crisis in Silicon Valley with John Vervaeke, and the podcast name was Village Global. So John talked a lot about his opinion of social media and of course, how to improve AI. But he spoke a lot about his work in general and made several interesting points, some of which I either haven't heard or don't recall hearing, or there were new spins on things. So it was a really good podcast. I highly recommend it. I'll put a link in the description. John was very nice to me in this podcast, and I feel like he's a good professor who's encouraging his student. That's really appreciated. But what he said about what I'm doing is so true, that I'm looking to Pirsig's writing as sacred texts, as texts that give me a profound sense of meaning. And indeed, I would say that when I really got into his work, I discovered something that seemed to get to the bottom of everything. It seemed to be a description of reality that rivals the one true description I had previously found, which is, of course, the Tao Te Ching. So these are texts you can go back to again and again to remind yourself that you are really here to cultivate meaning and wisdom, and they are guides as how to do so, no matter where you are. So thanks to John for the great insight, and I do believe his observation is correct. I'm putting forth Pirsig's writing as sacred texts, and that is my frame. Now, that isn't to say, and I think this is where John and I might diverge a little bit. I think that the metaphysics of quality is something that is so essential that it can be integrated into any practice. And in my case, I think that there is a place for that in a theistic worldview, a Christian worldview, and I think that I've got elements of that. You know, I've been talking about that. So what I'm saying is, when you have something that's so essential, it is compatible with a variety of ways of religions, let's just say. So obviously I listened to the whole podcast, and I want to point out a few things that interested me. The first thing was that John said that intelligence and rationality are not that correlated, that in fact there's a 0.3 correlation with intelligence with rationality, and I think this is counterintuitive, but it also makes sense when you look at the machinery and how it works. How well it functions doesn't mean that it can function well with bullshit as well as truth or reality. And Pirsig was figuring out a new rationality, one that's kind of has been described as a spiritual rationality. And John and I did talk about this in our discussion. And the same way that Pirsig was trying to update and transform rationality, John's doing the same thing. Not as something like the old way of rationality is, let's just say, procedural knowing, that is trying to dispense with anything that can't be proven, and dispense with anything that's not objective, whatever that means. Anything that's not propositional knowing. But for John, he's looking at rationality as a means to find intelligibility within all types of knowing, and specifically, in his case, making sense out of the procedural knowing, which is developing skills. You know, as you're developing skills, you need rationality to figure out if you're getting better. Perspectival knowing, which is orientation in any given situation, like figuring out what's going on, what the perspective is. And obviously you need rationality for that. You know, if you're in a different place, what lines up with what you already know? For example, like if you go to a different country, how are you going to get what you need if you don't speak the language? What is the perspective? Where are the things that line up with what is the case in your country? And participatory knowing. meaning that you're staying engaged, you're staying in the flow state, you're participating with the other person, anything where you and the environment are coexisting. And so rationality, obviously in that situation, is going to guide you into staying in the flow state, let's just say, or staying engaged, or answering, like if you're in a conversation with someone, responding appropriately, not in the old type of rational way, but responding as you two are co-creating what you were learning about yourself and the other person, or what you're learning about what you're talking about. So John says the old dichotomies, I guess you could say, that could be considered the sum total of our understanding, like everything it needs to fit in one or the other of these things, are being reevaluated as this new dynamic way of seeing emerges. And this is, of course, what we're discussing here in our varieties of how we discuss it, is a dynamic way of seeing rather than a dualistic way of seeing. So these dichotomies are like subjective versus objective, cause and effect, mind, body. He uses some different ones in the podcast, but these are the ones that stand out to me. And of course, subjective, objective, we've just talked about in Chapter 19, in the reading video, Chapter 19 of Zen, the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and we will certainly continue to talk about that in the book. So, cause and effect, for example, if you look at one of John's earlier videos on dynamical systems, you'll see how cause and effect really doesn't explain what's going on, that it's something much bigger than that isn't just cause, effect, and on down the line. It's a dynamic self-organizing system. It's constraints and conditions and constraints. And these dichotomies are, with the metaphysics of quality, it dispenses with these dichotomies, because the only reality in the metaphysics of quality is quality, and everything else comes from that. So like propositional knowing, objective reality, these dichotomies can explain a lot, but they leave a lot of leftover things that they can't explain. And Pirsig would call these platypi, just like the perplexing animal that doesn't fit into any category. Only the big picture, whether it's quality or relevance realization or God or Tao, these things, everything it counts for everything. Dichotomies are useful tools, but they are not the whole picture. Science is nested in religion. So he also mentioned what's going on politically and how we can't find meaning really in politics anymore, because politics is focused on winning rather than increasing wisdom. You're not going back and forth with the other side, creating something out of your respective knowledge. You're trying to beat your opponent. Certainly the case with the political divide these days. Authentic discourse is out, beating your opponent is in. So any wonder why we're in a meaning crisis, or this is probably an outcome of that. So I want you to think about something. Think about the great thinkers that inspire you. Now, how often do they declare allegiance to one side or the other? Not very often. So let's talk about practices. In the video, John mentioned meditative, contemplative movement practices, and practices based on the revelations of cognitive science, and how cognitive science can help you, let's just say, get over biases or see through bullshit. How we really think versus how we think we think. You see this in other people too, like Jonathan Haidt and the guy who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. I also want to mention Scott Adams, because I think Scott Adams' book Loser Think is really based a lot in the way we actually think versus the way we think we think. So if you are opposed to Scott Adams because of politics, I suggest you dispense with that for a second, because he has some really interesting things to say about this if you are trying to sort through bullshit. And Also, one of the practices that John didn't mention in this is, you've got mystical experiences, and he says we get mystical experiences, but we have no practice as to where to put them. Unlike the old practices, remember that, for example, the psychedelic practices are being revivified. You see these ayahuasca ceremonies around, and don't forget that Pirsig had his great revelation in Lila after a peyote ceremony. Also, both John and Pirsig are about integrating the East and West. A dynamic worldview is an integral worldview. Another thing John mentioned was a lower standard of living that younger people are going to face these days. And there's a lot of complexity the way he frames it. He says people are not going to have the same stuff their parents had, but they're going to be told that that's where meaning is in having this stuff, having status, having a Mercedes. And in times where the standard of living goes down, what you do is you cultivate meaning, but there's no way for these kids to cultivate meaning, so they're stuck being told that the reason they don't have meaning is because they don't work hard enough or something like that. I want to add something to that, which is that having a simpler lifestyle can help with meaning, and also having less stuff and having things that really function well. Remember, Eckhart Tolle has, the one thing he likes is his one mechanical watch. Watches, 99.9% of the watches you find are going to be battery run, quartz. But every now and then you find a wind-up or an automatic watch. And there's a real quality in that. And would you like to have 3 Yamaha motorcycles that look like they're out of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, or would you like to have one Superhawk from 1964 that keep running beautifully? So another thing John says, biology is going through a huge philosophical change, and I certainly know that after reading Behave by Robert Sapolsky, which I highly recommend. The real takeaway of the book is that very little in biology can explain any one factor. Things work with each other all the time. And, this is really interesting, the organism and the environment are in constant relationship. Epigenetics is a good example of that. The environment changes the genetics, which change the environment, which change the response to the environment, and back and forth. Dynamic. So in order, John said this, in order to away from the meaning crisis, we need to be connected to something more real than day-to-day reality, let's just say. I certainly believe this. From realizing that the law of gravity is an arbitrary categorization, look at chapter 3 of ZaMM, to getting out of our ego and value traps, you'll see this in the Gumption Chautauqua coming up, and to finding Buddha in the gears of a motorcycle. You will find endless examples in Pirsig's work of being connected to a greater reality, and that is the reality of quality. So in terms of practices, meditation, contemplation, authentic discourse, these are some that John mentioned. These are ways you get used to the fact that, so quality stimulates a quality. You have this feeling of quality, and then you have to figure out what it is. And the more you have, as Pirsig puts it, peace of mind, the more you're going to be able to manifest quality in an authentic, useful, and good way, rather than and then not think it's something it's not, because you're falling prey to self-deception and bullshit. Your quality detection, if from a point of peace of mind, which is what, in a broad way, what these practices assist to develop, your quality detection is better able not to allow parasitic processing. Your salience machinery won't be hijacked by bullshit. A lot of Pirsig's work addresses this. Finally, at the end of the podcast, the interviewer, Eric Dornberg, asks, what is the takeaway from your work on the meaning crisis? And John says the meaning crisis isn't about belief. It's about a deep kind of transformation, especially of the three ways of knowing that we are neglecting: the procedural, think motorcycle maintenance; the perspectival, think about, and this political problem, getting someone else's perspective, and participatory. Enough said about that. We are really lacking participatory practices and a notion of participating in the world. It's the propositional knowing that has really taken precedence, and John says this starts in like the 12th century. Pirsig points to Aristotle. And again, look at our discussion that John and I had, where John has some issue with that. Really interesting. That was great that we were able to talk about that. So, to see the world in terms of quality is transformative. It's a worldview that makes sense of things in totality, and you can, with that worldview, you live, and you live well, rather than always trying to categorize and always trying to justify. So, like Plato is to John, Pirsig is indeed to me. It's a sacred source of meaning, an endless fount of meaning that one can return to again and again, to enlighten, to refresh, and to guide you wherever you are in life. Kind of like the Bible or the Tao Te Ching. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.